Hey guys, thanks for joining us here again at Salty Ginger Talk. Glad to have you back. So, in today's episode, we're going to cover a topic that can be touchy, but it's one of the things that we preach a lot is that we need to look at facts, remove emotions from conversations to make good decisions to kind of help us solve problems. So, today we're looking at do police use deadly force on minorities at a disproportionate rate? So, again, touchy subject, and there's a couple of things we want to make sure we get on the table right up front. First, being any use of force is a worst case scenario. In a perfect world, police would not have to use any force on anybody. We know that's part of the job. There's a lot of discussion and a lot of controversy around how much of the job that should be, when it is and isn't appropriate, all of those things. But we all can agree that should be the last resort. We don't want use of force to be the default versus the exception. We want it to be the exception. Secondly, any loss of life is sad and it's the worst possible outcome of any situation. So nobody is happy that someone loses their life in an altercation, regardless of that altercation. Excuse me, whether it's with police or otherwise. Um, and every person's life matters. So I want to get that. I don't want to make light of and or make it diminish that in any way, shape, or form. I have a good friend who I went to high school with who lost a son in this scenario. So I'm very, very cognizant of it, and it's a terrible thing. It's absolutely a terrible thing. With that said, I still think you got to look at facts to determine how to deal with situations. And if we want good solutions, in my opinion, the best solutions come from fact based decisions and fact based approaches. And that's what we're trying to do here. So, with that, let's dive in a little more deeply to the subject. So, first, some obstacles to clear answers on this subject. So, I don't know that there's a silver bullet or a single solution. My argument would be, we need to definitely need to reinstate and or reemphasize just the value of life to people. There's seems to be a much less emphasis placed on that these days than there used to be, and that's to me that's a big part of it. I think a lot of it has to do with family and the family dynamic, mental illness, drug abuse. I think all those things play a part in this conversation, but we're looking at data today. So there is a major lack of readily available data. Most police precincts do not explicitly collect data on use of force, and that in itself is problematic. It really should be something that the police do on a regular basis, so that they can use that data to make better decisions and train their people on proper use of force, the proper situations in which they should use force, how to de-escalate, all of those things. And I do think body cameras and reviewing footage on body cameras is a big part of what the solution is here. Um, Many of them just simply report the number of officer involved shootings, and that doesn't provide much context to a situation. So, there are lots of variables and lots of reasons why use of force happens. Some of them completely unjustified, some of them, in my opinion, completely justified. And without context, I think it's really hard to provide. I think this all happens in gray areas most of the time. It's rare that you see a black and white situation where, yeah, that clearly had to happen, or hey, that's way out of bounds. I think most of this happens in gray areas, and without the context around these situations, I think it's difficult to draw a whole bunch of conclusions. So we're working off of numbers because it's what we've got, but it's an imperfect situation and imperfect conclusions, in my opinion, for sure. The last thing I'll say on that is simply because an officer is white and the victim is a minority does not necessarily mean the use of force was racially motivated. Um, there situations where it happens, of course, without a doubt. I'm not denying that for a second. But simply because the dynamic is a white officer and a non-white victim or suspect, whatever you want to refer to the person on the other end of that interaction, that does not in of itself make it racially motivated. It just does not. And again, I'm certain. I have no doubt there's instances where it is racially motivated. So With all that said, let's talk a little bit about where we found most of the data that we're going to talk about. So we're using statistics from a Harvard economics professor named Roland Fryer. He published an abstract in 2017, and we're putting a link here in case you want to read it. I've boiled it down very, very far. It's a 56-page abstract with tons of data. He shows the methods, the methodology behind the studies, the methodology behind which the research came, the math by which he drew his conclusions. So it's very, very thorough. And I'm just covering what I found were interesting points in it. I would highly, if you're interested in this topic and really want to kind of understand it better, it's a great read. He does a really good job of laying it out on a factual basis. And I will say that according to him, and we also linked an article to this, when he released his abstract, it caused a great deal of controversy and personal challenges for him. So we've included a link to show that I think it was pretty gutsy of this guy, who happens to be black, to release this data against the urgings of multiple people that were close to him. They said, look, this is not what people want to hear. A lot of the conclusions you draw are going to be unpopular, and you should really think twice before you do this. He did it, and it turns out his friends and or colleagues and or confidants were correct that this was going to open up a firestorm when he did it, and it did. So he used 4 data sets to analyze data and draw conclusions. And we're going to cover those 4 here real quick. New York City had a stop and frisk program whereby officers were encouraged to stop people, ask them questions without any real reason, and then frisk them for contraband. You could agree or disagree with that program. It did yield a ton of data. So this was from roughly 5 million observations. We've talked before. Any of us that understand math and statistics and are used to trying to make conclusions based on math and statistics know that the bigger the data set you draw conclusions from, generally the better conclusions you're able to draw. So, we talk a lot about, if you want to talk about democracy or explain democracy to someone, explain that if 2 wolves and a sheep vote on what's for dinner, you know what's for dinner, and that's democracy. There were three entities, 2 of them voted, 1 lost, and he's dinner. With 5 million observations, that's a lot. That's a lot of data to be able to draw conclusions from. So I do think it's useful. And there was very detailed information in the wide range of uses of force in these interactions, the stop and frisk interactions, which included just putting your hands on a civilian to hitting them with a baton. So pretty wide ranging set of information here, a lot of data. And then there's a police public contact survey. It's done every 3 years. This was interesting. It was included because it's from the civilians' point of view. It's civilians explaining from their perspective how their interactions happened with police officers, including the use of force. The third data set was event summaries from all incidents in which an officer discharges their weapon. And that's shooting at and hitting or shooting at and missing a suspect, a non-police officer. That's from 3 large cities in Texas, Austin, Dallas, and Houston. It's from 6 large Florida counties and then Los Angeles County. And then he also pulled data from a random sample of police-civilian interactions from the Houston Police Department, specifically from arrest codes. So if you hear it, so 187 in progress, 223 in progress. So they tried to use arrest codes in which lethal force is more likely to be justified. Those codes were attempted murder of a public safety officer, aggravated assault of a public safety officer, resisting arrest, evading arrest, and interfering in arrest. So, a lot of background. I wanted to make sure everyone knew this is not just me espousing some random theory. I didn't look for some quack who drew conclusions that I wanted to agree with or not agree with. I tried to find people who drew conclusions off of large data sets and did so in an unemotional and methodical way. So, with all that said, let's dive into what some of the findings were. First, on the New York City stop and frisk data, it showed that blacks and Hispanics were 50% more likely to have an interaction with police that involves any use of force. So we're going to talk a little bit later on the actual shootings and or death by a from a civilian by a police officer, but the data shows clearly that if you are black or Hispanic in New York, in particular, and no reason to think that doesn't apply. I guess there could be different demographics, but you're 50% more likely to be involved in interaction with police where they touch you, they push you against the wall, they wrestle you, they hit you with a baton, whatever. So if blacks or Hispanics think the police are more aggressive with them, there's a lot of data to back up that conclusion. A lot of data. Now, it is worth noting that as the intensity of force increases, so from putting your hand on, hey, stand over here, to some type of wrestling match, throwing someone onto the ground, throwing someone against the wall, slamming someone down in a car, the likelihood that anyone is subjected to that treatment is small, but the racial disparity remains even with the increased use of force. So if you are black or Hispanic, you're much more likely than a non-black or non-Hispanic to wind up having an interaction with police that involves one of those things. With that said, those things are exceedingly rare for anyone in society because there's like 10 million arrests a year, and we're talking about 2% of those interactions. 0.26% of interactions between police and civilians involve an officer drawing a weapon. 0.02% involve using a baton. With all that said, blacks were 21% more likely than whites to be involved in interaction with police where a weapon is drawn, a taser, a gun, a baton, whatever the case may be. So if you have heard from black or Hispanic friends, acquaintances, anecdotally, that they feel like the police are more aggressive with them, there's a lot of data to back that up. A lot of data to back that up. Now, where it gets interesting, at least I shouldn't say that's not interesting because it is interesting, but where the narrative that we commonly hear is counter to the data is when it involves shootings. So the Houston data in particular showed that blacks are 27.4% less likely to be shot at by police than non-black, non-Hispanics. So that's pretty significant when you think about it. That the police tend to be, based on the data, the police tend to be much more physically aggressive with blacks and Hispanics, but they seem to be much less likely to actually shoot at black or Hispanic suspects and or interactions. So I did find that very interesting because that's where the things kind of started to flip, in that the narrative that we have heard, or that I have heard, that I've been exposed to, is if you're black or Hispanic, the police are much more likely to be aggressive with you. There's a lot of data to back that up. That seems very legitimate based on the data that's out there. But the narrative that police are trigger happy or want to shoot and kill black or Hispanic folks, the data does not support that. Also wanted to do a little bit more. I wanted to try to find some more data from which we could have a conversation and at least get people thinking about this in a different way. So I pulled data from Heather McDonald. She is I think she's the Manhattan Institute, and we included a link to this as well so that you could research this and see the data that we pulled on this. She pulled a lot of data and statistics around this subject. So in New York City in 2018, 73% of shooting victims, not by police, just shooting victims in general, were black. So of the people who were shot in New York in 2018, 73% of those people were black. And black residents only make up 24% of the city's population. So you are way more likely to experience gun violence in New York if you're black than if you are any other ethnicity. So that's problematic in of itself, because set the police conversation aside for a second. We got to help folks out. We got to figure out some way to stop this from happening. And I know there's a lot of conversation around gun control. There's a lot of conversation around those types of things. I don't know. It just seems like there's a lot of guns out there, but in that subset of our society, you are way at way more risk than any other subset of society, and that's troubling. On that topic, nationally across the entire country, blacks are blacks between the ages of 10 and 34 die from homicide at 13 times the rate of white Americans. Um, and that's according to researchers from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Justice Department. So, government entities, that's government sanctioned data. So, you're 13 times, if you're black, you're 13 times more likely than a white person to die from homicide. And we do know across all ethnicities, the vast majority of homicides are perpetrated by someone of your ethnicity. So if you're white, you should be the most afraid of white people because it's white people that kill white people in general. It's black people that kill black people in general. It's Hispanic people that kill Hispanic people in general. And I'm talking like to the rates of 80 to 90%. The vast majority of homicides are committed by people of the same race. So this boogeyman of different ethnicities going to war with each other, the data just doesn't tease that out. It is absolutely your own race and your own culture that you should be the most concerned about. And the black, if you're black, you have a much higher statistical probability of experiencing that type of violence than if you're not. Now, moving back to the police civilian conversation, from 2016 to 2020, each year, the police have fatally shot about 1,000 civilians. Now, that doesn't mean armed or unarmed, that just means total. And those numbers are pretty accurate because the police, you have to report, and it gets recorded when somebody dies. And when you die at the hands of the police, that gets recorded. So about 1,000 a year total across all ethnicities, across everywhere in the country. Police shoot about 1,000 civilians annually. Now, the majority of those were armed or otherwise dangerous, trying to hit you with their car, trying to wrestle you, throw you off a building, whatever the case may be. That doesn't mean all of them, but the vast majority of them were armed and dangerous. Now, of those 1,000 civilians, now let's just pause there for a second because there's around 10 million arrests in any particular year. And 1,000 of those interactions, 1,000 out of 10 million, result in someone being shot and killed by police. So, if you look at it from that perspective, this is not, the data does not support that the police are trigger happy and out there looking to shoot at people. If you are personally impacted by this, I understand that's going to be you're going to have a very different feeling and very different take on that situation. And I am absolutely empathetic to that. With that said, we have to look at data to make broader decisions for the broader society. And I'm not trying to diminish anyone's personal experiences if they have experienced this type of violence in their life and lost a loved one to this type of violence. It's a terrible thing. Totally understand that, and I'm not trying to diminish that. With that said, the data doesn't show that we have a rampant problem with police targeting civilians and trying to kill them. It just doesn't tease that out. Now, of that 1,000 a year, black people account for 23% of those shot and killed by police, but are only about 13% of the total U.S. population. With all that said, so if you say 23% of 1,000, that's 230, right? It just is. That's the math. With that said, there are about 7,300 black homicide victims a year. So it's much more likely, if you are of any ethnicity, it's much more likely to be attacked by a non police officer than it is to be shot at by a police officer. And again, across ethnicities, the percentage of homicides that are committed by someone of your race, you are much more likely to be assaulted and or attacked by someone of your race than you are not. So we see on the news all these outlier situations, and they're terrible. Whatever. I'm of this ethnicity, and some of a different ethnicity attacked me in the alley, or attacked me in the parking lot, or attacked me in the park, whatever the case may be. It's exceedingly rare. It's very rare that those instances happen. They get a ton of news coverage because it's what sells newspapers and it gets people to click on stuff. And I would encourage you to think about that and not let it affect you emotionally. try to take a step back, assess the situation, and ask yourself, is this a terrible situation? Of course it is. Is it the norm? Is it the majority? Is it the default? No, it's not. The data just does not show that it is. Um, and so, the last statistic I found, given the number of arrests they make each year, police make each year around 10 million, and the number of deadly weapon attacks on officers, an average of 27 per day. That's pretty crazy. So what that's saying is there's 10 million arrests, and while police are out doing their jobs across the country, 27 per day are attacked with some type of a deadly weapon, a knife, a baseball bat, a golf club, a gun, a car. So it's pretty dangerous to be a police officer when you look at it from that perspective. 27 per day. That's what, 7,000-8,000 a year. That's a lot. So with all that said, it just doesn't show that 1,000 people killed by the police each year shows an out of control police department. Um, there's tons of room for improvement. There's tons of room for training. Our goal here should be zero. Our goal should be nobody killed by anybody ever, especially the police. But they're the ones that get called when things are tough. They're the ones that get called when emotions are high. They're the ones that get called when people are out of control, that are high on drugs, that are having a mental health challenge. There's lots of situations where they get deployed, and I don't think defunding the police is the solution, but I absolutely think additional training, additional support, and mental health support for the police as well. That's a tough job. And it wouldn't surprise me a bit that tons of them are suffering from PTSD, depression, being around those situations all the time can be a real drag. I'm certain of it. And I think we have to have better resources in place, training resources, mental health resources, um, all resources to help police through the challenge that they have. And we also need to aggressively pursue and get rid of bad police officers who are motivated by race, who are power hungry, who are quick to pull a gun or pull a weapon. Those, some people just aren't suited for that job. And if you're not, and you somehow wound up in that job, you need to get out, whether it's of your choice or our choice. I think we got to get rid of those folks. So anyhow, so to recap, if you are a minority, yeah, the police are more aggressive with you. The statistics show the police are more aggressive with you, but the police are not going around and shooting at anyone in particular, just kind of willy nilly. And it's much more likely that if you're white to be shot at by police than if you're black. So I found that interesting. Like I said, we included all the data that we've got here. And again, I don't want to diminish anyone's experience. Someone that's been touched by this, it's a terrible thing and it sticks with you for the rest of your life. I don't want to diminish that. I don't want to ignore that. But I do think it's important that as we're making decisions, how we want to act as a society and the things we want to focus on as a society, I think it's important to look at numbers. I think it's important to look at data. I think it's important to look at what really happens every day out in the world. So, hope you found that interesting. Hope you found it useful. I hope it makes you think, so you can have good conversations with people and in your communities work with volunteer groups, with police, with other folks to come up with solutions so we can keep people safe and happy in our country. So thanks a lot, guys, for joining us. Don't forget to head over to our website, saltygingertalk.com. We've got links to all our social on there. You can subscribe to our newsletter there, and all of our podcast episodes are there as well. Would love it if you would like and subscribe on whatever platform you are using to consume our content. And we really appreciate you checking us out. We hope to see you next time. Everybody have a good day.